Okay, we're going to talk about growing squash in Kentucky, but don't worry, if you are outside of Kentucky, the same rules and the same things will apply. The only difference will be your planting and frost dates will be different, and you'll have to plant accordingly according to your area and what your season is where you live. So a little history. I like to start most of these with some history of the crop, especially when it's something that's important as squash was, especially for the Native Americans. The word squash actually comes from the Narragansett Native American word for ascuda squash, which is easy for me to say, I guess, which means eaten raw or cooked. And you can eat squash raw or cooked. I don't know if you've ever tasted of it raw, but you can eat it raw, but it doesn't taste very good to me. The ancestral species of squash were in the Americas before the arrival of humans, which was over 30,000 years ago. And then the species of squash we are familiar with as good sources are native to the New World. Most of the gourd types, they are native to Africa, such as the bottle gourd, the gourds, the dipper gourds, all those kinds of things. They're not native to our hemisphere. Squash likely originated in the Southwest United States, Mexico, Mesoamerica, and South America, and then it moved with the settler, with the Native Americans through the continent. The earliest proven evidence of domestication of squash dates back at least 8,000 years, and some archaeological digs actually in Ecuadorian caves suggest it may have been further back than that, as far back as 12,000 years. Squash was the first of the three sisters. There you can see the three sisters in the picture there. It was the first to be domesticated. It predated maize or corn, whatever you want to call it, and beans for about 4,000 years there. And you can see there that the Native Americans called those the three sisters because they could grow them successfully together. Native Americans used squash as a food staple, with different types being grown to eat at different types of the year. We'll talk about all these different types here in just a few minutes. And also, they also ate their seeds as well. I don't know if you've ever toasted the seeds. They are pretty tasty. Squash were grown by Native Americans from southern parts of Canada all the way down to Argentina and Chile. So they were a very important food crop that they could save seeds and carry those with them as they migrated. There are roughly 27 species of cucurbits identified in the Americas, with 5 that have been domesticated, and most of them actually will cross with each other, even the wild types. So if you want to save seeds, you need to keep these separated because they will cross. Some of the types that we grow here, we have, this is the Cucurbita maxima. It does have a round, thick stem there, as you can see it. And this includes the types such as the winter squashes, their buttercups, the Hubbard's turbans, winter's pumpkins, some of those kinds of things. These usually have large fruit with hard seeds, and they ripen in the fall. So this is one of the winter squash group. And you need to peel these to actually eat them because of the outside is so hard, but that's what allows them to be stored so long. They can be stored for several months. Some of these types I have stored up to a year and eaten them, and they were still fine. And that was at room temperature. Then we have Cucurbita Moschata. I was looking it up earlier to make sure that I said it right, and I still didn't. But this is also a winter squash. This group includes the butternuts and some of the musky winter squashes. It's not quite as big a family as the maximas are. Then we have Cucurbita pepa, or pepo, however you want to say it. These all have the prickly stems, and these are the ones when you reach in to pick. The summer squash, these are the ones that will give you a little rash if you're allergic to them and make you itch. These includes the summer squashes, the zucchinis, some of the Italian types, the French types, crooknecks, even spaghetti squash, believe it or not, is in this group, even though spaghetti squash can be stored just a little bit longer than some of the other summer squashes. But that's because we're allowing them to mature all the way out, whereas the summer squashes like the crooknecks and the zucchinis and things, we're eating those small before they actually mature. That's where they won't keep quite as long. But these usually have a soft outer skin that we actually do eat, unless you're doing maybe the spaghetti squash. But these are summer harvested. These are our summer squashes. Then we have Cucurbita. I'm going to laugh. Argosperma, which is The silver-seeded gourd are also the striped cushaw. So if you like cushaw, and this is in that group, it's pretty much the only two that we eat out of this group that's actually been domesticated. And then we have Cucurbita Cofolia, which is the fig leaf gourd or black-seeded squash. This one's probably not you're probably not very familiar with this one, but it is eaten probably more of a South American type, but it's not regularly known in our parts, of North America. But you can grow these here if you want to try them. You will notice that it has a lot of big seeds inside of it, though. And then we move on to a little more history. As a squash is listed as one of the 7 new world foods that changed Europe forever, along with the potato, the sunflower, corn, cacao, tomato, and bananas. The first images of squash actually in the Old World were in Touraine, France, and they date back between 1503 and 1508. And this picture, or this pumpkin here, or squash here in the video, is actually the one that's in the painting from that date. So that variety is still out there if somebody wanted to try it. The first definite record of squash being a food source in the Old World was around 1591. Now, I'm sure that it was used as a food crop for animals a lot, several years before that. As far as culture for squash, it is the same as all of our other vegetable crops. It needs full sun, which is 6 hours or more of full sun a day to grow at its optimum. We're going to talk about the soil, the access, the air drainage, and the proximity to trees and shrubs as well. First off, your soil, you need well drained. If you have heavy clay soil, I know most parts of Kentucky have a lot of clay, but you could always add organic matter to loosen that up. You could also do raised beds. With organic matter, we're talking compost, leaf molds, those kinds of things. Do not use sand because, again, sand and clay forms concrete, right, when it gets hot and dry. So we don't want that. Make sure you work your soils down to 6 to 7 inches deep. That's going to give you a good depth of loose soil for those roots to get down into the soil. And you also want to remove large stones and clods or plant debris, and particularly important with root crops, but this is not a root crop, but the less impedance of hard things in the soil, the better for these plants. And just remember, if you've got rocks in your soil that's not holding water or nutrients, and if you have a drought, then you've got you got less soil area for those roots to actually be in. We do recommend, as always, Extension always tells you to get a soil test. It's the only way we know exactly what kind of nutrients you have in your soil. This is best done in the fall before planting, but you still have time this year to do it now. We like for you to do that at least every 3 years. Now is a good time to go ahead and do that. Maybe you can get that soil test back in the next 2 or 3 weeks in time to plant squash after our frost-free date is passed. You want to sample 6 to 7 inches deep in 5 areas or so of your garden, and randomly pick those spots. If you've got a larger garden, pick a few more spots. All we're trying to do there is get an average of your area so we can give you a range of what you may need in your soil. When we do a soil test, we're going to test for pH. Ideally, we want our pH be between 6.0 and 6.8 for squash. We're also going to check your phosphorus and potassium. We don't have a test for nitrogen because it's transient in the soil, so it will give you a recommendation on how much nitrogen you will need for this, whatever crop you're growing. For this instance, it's going to be squash. And then also, organic matter is always good for your soil, so keep that in mind. Now, if you do not want to do a soil test, you can apply triple 10 at 25 pounds per 1,000 square feet. That's going to hedge your bets for your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But with fertilizer prices, you may not need anything but the nitrogen, so there's no reason to waste your money on all the other nutrients if you don't need those in your soil. Compost is very important. It's very good. So if you've got some compost laying around, or if you've got a pile, go ahead and use it. It will improve your water retention. It'll promote soil structure, which makes your tilth better, and it just loosens your soil. It increases your fertility because of all the nutrients that's in that compost. It increases your cation exchange capacity, which is actually the nutrient availability in your soil. So it allows your soil to hold more nutrients and then release it to the plants as the plants need it. It also reduces your fertilizer requirements by up to 50%. So if you put some compost on there and you've got reasonably good soil, you may not need anything else. So that's why it's good to get your soil test done, and we'll know ahead of time. It also enhances microbial activity, which actually can suppress the bad guys. The good guys can suppress the pathogens in your soil, the bacteria or the fungus or fungal issues you may have in your soil that can infect your plants. These good guys can actually break those down and they can cause your plants less harm. Also, it can accelerate the breakdown of pesticides and other synthetic compounds that may be in your soil. Say you're in an urban area and there's some things in your soil that you may be there and you haven't checked, or it could be not even just urban, but I know we come up with that sometimes, some of those issues in more urban areas than in rural, but you could also have those, especially the pesticides and things in your soil in rural areas. These good guys can help break those down and get those out of there for you. Another biggie, especially for squash and especially for summer squash, is access. You want this to be close enough to the house that you're going to be willing to harvest these regularly, especially these summer squashes. You're going to be harvesting these every day or every other day at least. If not, they're going to get too big for you and you're going to have to pull those off and toss those. Whereas if you pick them every day or every other day, you get small ones, ones that you actually want to eat. It's also going to make it accessible for weeding and cultivating. Also, usually if it's near the house, it's going to be close to a water source if we have a drought. And also, it can be maybe a deterrent for some varmints that might want to get into your squash, such as deer and some other pests that may get in there. I know I've not usually had much damage with deer, but you never know, especially if you're in an area where maybe there's not a lot of other things for them to eat. They may come through there and try to munch on your squash as well, or anything else in your garden for that matter. But if it's close to the house, it's a little more deterrent than if it's further away from the house. Air drainage is not usually a huge deal for squash unless you're really trying to get them started earlier. But low-lying areas can actually be a little too wet for some of these plants. So you need to keep that in mind. If you want to plant early or get a late crop, then frost might be an issue. So you want to plant high up because warm air rises and cold air sinks. So you may get frost at the valley, but not a frost on top of the area. It's also good to put them in a protected spot where we don't have thunderstorm winds blowing these plants around. You know, around here in July, we'll usually have those storm fronts come in with some wind gusts and things can blow these over. So if you can plant them in a direction that they may be shielded, that's going to be for the best. The other thing is airflow is really good because it dries the foliage and it does help control diseases. And these can get some diseases later in the season, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. Another issue is maybe proximity to trees and shrubs. Obviously, they can give you unwanted shade. They're going to compete for water and nutrients with those large root systems they have. Another one is juglone toxicity. You don't want to plant close to a black walnut because you can get some damage from the juglone in the plant that it emits from its roots and its stems, leaves, all parts of the plant, and which is just a growth regulator for other plants. It's a defense mechanism for that plant. Another one is you want to slate your garden at least 10 feet. If it's a shrub or something, that 10 feet may be enough, but if it's a larger tree, you may need to go a lot further than that because those root systems can really spread out. And especially if you've been growing in an area for a while and there's trees around and you've watered in a drought and you're fertilizing, those tree roots are going to work their way over to your garden. So ideally, the further you can get them, the better. Weed control is always an issue with anything we grow, no different with squash. The weeds compete with plants for sunlight, water, nutrients, and space for that matter. You can reduce perennial weeds before planting. You can use solarization with clear plastic, as you see there in the bed. And you do need clear. Black, you would think is hotter, but it does not allow the solar rays to go through it. So you don't get as hot under there as you would with this clear, which is actually allowing the sun rays to come through and they're getting trapped under there. So think of how hot your car gets in the summertime. And this is the same concept. We're just heating it up to a point that will kill everything under there. Also, herbicides can work if you put them on before or far enough ahead of time to kill the plants before it's time to plant. Roundup would be one of those, which is glyphosate as the active ingredient in that. Also, preen you could use after plant if you wanted to keep seeds from germinating. You could use that after you've got your squash up and growing. It does say that you can go ahead and plant bigger seeded things even with preen. I don't like to take that chance. I like to get my plants up actively growing and then plant them and then put the preen down. where I don't take that chance of that preen actually affecting that seedling ahead of time. Tillage is probably the right way most of us are going to do this, and we're just going to till that area down to kill the weeds or whatever's growing there in that area ahead of time. Also, hoeing regularly will keep your annual weeds under control if you don't want to use a herbicide or a mulch or something like that. And then once actively growing, the vining crops actually do compete really well with the weeds. And a lot of times once they start to vine, we couldn't do anything about some of the weeds out there anyway, but they do compete really well once they're actively growing. They'll go right over top of some of these weeds. Water is an issue if we have a drought, but for most of the time we don't have a huge issue with needing to water these crops. Some years you just never know, but most years they do reasonably well unless we have a really bad drought. But from optimum growth, they need about 1 inch of water per week. However, they'll take a drought and come back out, or they'll kind of slow when we have a drought, and then they'll start growing again once we get some rain. One thing you do want to not do is what's going on in this picture here. You do not want to overhead water when you do irrigate. Remember, the more time your foliage is wet, the higher chances you have for disease. Another is you have a lot of evaporation whenever you water by overhead. So you want to put something down like a soaker hose or something in water with. That way you get the water exactly where you need it. Temperatures can be a problem depending on what time of year you're trying to grow some of these warm season crops. Squash, again, is a warm season crop, and they do develop best at temperatures greater than 50 degrees, and they are killed by frost. So you got to think about that in your early planting, and think about how late you want to get your plants to cut at the end of the season to make sure we don't have a frost too soon and maybe the pumpkins or whatever are not mature enough to actually keep after harvest. This is a map of Kentucky, and this just gives you our frost-free dates. The average date of our last killing frost is last killing frost, which we consider that to be 36 degrees in the spring, plus the average number of days between the last frost in spring and the first frost in the fall. And you can see there in the black, that's mostly Western Kentucky, but there's a little tip there of some of Southern Kentucky and a little bit of Far East Kentucky that's in this. Their last date is April the 20th to the 30th. And then we have in the white area, which is more Central Kentucky, April the 30th to May the 5th. And then in the higher elevations in Eastern Kentucky, the mountainous areas, it's May the 5th to the 10th. Now, can this vary in a year? As absolutely can. This is just our frost-free dates. This frost is usually later, our frost-free date is later than a freeze date. If you remember last year, we had a freeze, I think it was like May the 1st. So you never know, so just hedge your bets and don't plant too early. And even if you plant early and we have a cold spell, maybe not enough to kill these plants, it is going to kind of stunt them and they're just going to sit there anyway. So just wait until the weather warms up and plant these and they'll really take off. Vining squash should only be grown if adequate space is available. When I say that, that's pumpkins are included in the squash. They're in the same family. They will vine up to 20 feet or more, depending on varieties. So if you're going to grow the viney types, make sure you got plenty of space available for them. You don't want them, they'll climb right over tomato plants and anything else if they get the chance to. So if they're too close to things, they'll go and you'll be having a nightmare trying to get them down and keeping them off of other plants. You can also grow some of the vining squash and pumpkins, and I said squash and pumpkins interchangeable because they're in the same group. You can grow those under the corn. That's the Three Sisters. They do reasonably well with a little bit of shade from the corn. And a lot of times when the Native Americans planted these, remember they were not growing sweet corn. They were growing corn to dry for for meal or any of the other ways they used it. So they were letting that plant grow, and it was drying all the way down. And during that time, they were growing dry beans that were climbing up those stalks. And then we had the pumpkins underneath there growing on the ground. So they got the three crops there on the same area. Also, by growing them this way, they had the beans there with the corn and the pumpkins. So the beans made nitrogen, and both the other plants got to use some of that nitrogen. So it was a good way to use these three crops, and very, very ingenious, actually. You do want to use crop rotation on these cucurbit plants because the diseases can overwinter, and we'll talk about a few of those diseases in a minute. So with any other crop you grow, we want to do crop rotation. This is no different with this group of plants. You do want to plant after danger of frost has passed. If you want pumpkins for Halloween, though, you need to count based on maturity days. Otherwise, they could rot, not even make it to Halloween if you want to use it for decoration. Or another reason to count your days, if you plant too late, they may not be mature enough by the time we get a frost or a freeze, and then they won't keep either. So if it takes 90 days for that particular variety to mature, then you're going to count back, say, from October the 15th, back 90 days at least, until you know that you're in the range there for it to be mature whenever you want it to be. If you're planting vining squash, you can also plant them in hills. I know some of the older people like to plant them in hills. It's totally up to you how you want to do that, but if you do plant them in hills, you need to space them 8 to 12 feet apart in all directions. That's just going to allow enough room for them to vine out so they can have enough room, sun, air, all the things they need to make you a nice crop. You can also just plant them in rows. If you do them in rows, you want to do them 12 feet apart with 6 to 8 feet within the row. Again, either way you want to plant is fine. As long as you're giving them space, that's just the big key here. The bush types of squash, they need to be planted 3 feet apart in rows, and your rows about 4 feet apart. A little bit further spacing will not hurt. It may be even better if you've got a really rich soil and they get large. You may need a little more space than that, but it's totally up to you how you do that. But generally speaking, if you give them 3 feet apart and 4 feet within the row, they're going to be fine. You can plant them however you like that way. You could do them on hills too, but obviously you would do your hills a lot closer together if you wanted to try to do that. Squash need a lot of water, especially once they have set fruit. When I say squash in this context, I'm talking more of pumpkins. And once they set fruit, the drought, if we have a drought, that will drastically reduce your size of your pumpkins. So if you're wanting something larger, then you're going to actually definitely need to give them water. 1 to 2 inches per week is going to have them growing optimally, where they're growing that size of that pumpkin. If you're growing winter squash, same difference. If you want really large cushaw, the more water you give while that fruit is just set and growing, the better that plant's going to size up quickly and get large for you. You do need a side dress when the plants begin to vine with about 1 pound of urea per 1,000 square feet. That again also will help the fruit size up well too, because it's going to increase your vining. Once your fruit is set, if you've got a lot of vine growth, then all that energy is going to go into that one large fruit or multiple fruit, however you want to do it. If you want one large, you'll pick the other ones off. If you want multiple, let them all just set and you'll still get nice size. But that little bit extra fertilizer then is what's going to size those up. You don't need to do that with your summer squashes. As far as weed control, they can be an issue if not kept relatively under control. And again, it depends on what varieties you're growing here. But preen, if you're going to grow bare soil, will help you. If you sprinkle some of that around, it'll keep some of those weeds from germinating. That will help. Mulch is always going to be a good friend to keep weeds down. Also, mulch is going to help with your moisture. So mulch for me is one of the #1 things to keep your weeds down. I don't care if you use black plastic, if you use landscape fabric, if you use straw or any other organic material, anything like that's going to be good for these plants because of keeping the moisture even in the soil, so you don't have as much fluctuation, because these can get blossom and rot as well. And it's also going to keep your weeds down. Some other problems you might find are squash vine borer. When you have a squash vine borer, usually your plant looks great one day, it starts to wilt another day, and by the 3rd or 4th day, your plant's pretty much collapsed and gone. If you think you've got squash vine borer, you look down at the base of the plant, and you should see some frass coming out from the base of the plant, and you'll see a few holes in the stem, or maybe like they're even cracked open. If you see that, then you've probably 100% chance got squash vine borer, and you will get these periodically. Some years are worse than others. If you don't crop rotate, don't get rid of the debris each year, you're probably going to have a higher chance of having these as well. And you can see inside that stem there, it's a pretty big grub looking like borer in that stem that's burrowed that out, and that's what's killing the plant. I've had a zucchini, believe it or not, that I've actually split the stem and there was 6 of those borers in that size in there at one time. So if you do have a plant that wilts and goes down, you think there's squash vine borer in there, definitely go in there and kill all of those, because you don't want those to mature, because it's just adding to your problem this year if you've got other squash there, but also in future years if you're not getting these under control while you can. So you want to monitor your vines, obviously, from mid to late June through August. And then if you do know you have them, say if you have one plant that's got them, you'll destroy it. Definitely want to go ahead and spray the other ones if they're not infected yet. And you can target your sprays to the stem, especially towards the base of the stems, because that's where they usually like to lay their eggs. So the goal is to kill them before they ever burrow into the plant. So you want to have the insecticide on there whenever those eggs hatch and that larva tries to burrow in. It's going to get that lethal dose before it gets into the plant, and then your plant's going to be safe. Some insecticides that you would use for that is Salvin 7, which is carbaryl, and malathion. There's other things you could probably use. Insecticidal soaps and those things won't be effective for these, because insecticidal soap works by actually you spraying it on the insect, and it covers the insect over and it can't breathe, so it dies. Well, these eggs, it's not going to really make much difference. When they hatch out, they're going to eat a little bit of soap and burrow right into the plant, and it's not going to affect them much. Squash bug is another one that you're definitely going to find if you grow squash, pumpkins, and any of these cucurbit plants. They usually show up generally late in July and then early August, and they'll go all the way, through the rest of the season, especially if you've got some plants out there. They are hard to control once your populations are allowed. They're pretty much impossible to control once you allow that population to get to a great number. And you can see the little larvae there, the little gray ones that are a little young, and then we have the adult squash bug under there. And almost looks like a stink bug, but it's a squash bug. And then you see the egg masses. Those egg masses there are kind of copper colored, and they're really hard. You'll see them on the plants. When you do, go ahead and just take those egg masses out of there, because you're getting rid of a lot of little baby squash bugs by getting those out of there. They are really hard, though. A lot of times you have to just take that little piece of the leaf with the eggs and then mash them on a rock or something like that. They're even hard to squeeze and pop with your fingers. They're that hard of eggs. But definitely, anytime you see those egg masses, go ahead and just take those out. These are hard to control, though, even especially as adults, because of their piercing, sucking mouth parts, and it's hard for them to get enough insecticide when they're feeding that way to actually give them a lethal dose. So again, go out there, take a look at the plants every day or every few days, and if you see those egg masses, get those out. That's going to be a key to keeping these under control until late in the season. Whenever at that point you may not be able to actually get them under control. Crop rotation is a big key for controlling these. You want to make sure that you've got, if you're growing squash in the same spot every year, we've had squash bugs, you're just increasing your own problem every year. So definitely do crop rotation. Clean your beds out in the fall, get all that old debris out of there and destroy it. Manually destroy your egg masses, as I just said earlier. And then insecticides you can try. You want to time them according to when your nymphs or the young are just hatching. They don't work well, again, on adults. But if you do know that you've had a few hatch, target your sprays at the base of the plant. They usually like to hide at the base of the plant, or even under, if you've got straw or something like that for a mulch. They'll sometimes hide under that mulch and stuff too. So target your spray down low. 7, malathion, some of the pyrethrins will work. And if you get out there and you monitor early in the season, if you can get those adults, the adults that are laying the eggs, if you see any of those, go ahead and kill those too. You can lower that population, and maybe you can have a relatively squash bug free season. But you can see these young here. This is on an old pumpkin here where they've already destroyed all the leaf, and the plant's dead, and then they've gone on to the fruit. Cucumber beetles, they can be an issue. They're not usually a huge problem with feeding, but they can be if the numbers get high enough. They feed on pollen, flowers, and then the late season feeding can damage the fruit. If you're trying to sell these, you want these for decoration or something, then that can be a problem. Their main problem is that they vector bacterial wilt. That's why we like to keep their numbers under control. And that bacterial wilt, they when they feed on the plant, there's a bacteria in their mouth, and they'll get into the plant and it'll stop the vascular system up to the plant. So you do want to monitor for these beetles. They will have a large hatch for 2 to 3 weeks and then dwindle. So if you can keep that large hatch under control, you can pretty much keep them under control for the season. If you don't keep them under control and they have those large hatches over those 2 or 3 weeks, and the numbers build up greatly, you can see this pumpkin here. The skin of the actual fruit's been fed on there, and you can see that it's scarred over where they've actually scraped the top layer of the skin off by eating it, and it's all scarred there. So that's going to be no good for decoration after that. When you start seeing these, you can go ahead and treat with 7 or pyrethrins or malathion. And then early in the season, when you first see them, it's going to be your best bet to keep them under control. And then that way you won't have that huge population of them later. Some diseases that you might find is powdery mildew. You're definitely going to see powdery mildew pretty much every year at some point during the growing season. And you can see there in the picture there, the leaves are just covered with the powdery looking mold there. It's on the top side of the leaf generally, and it will eventually kill the leaf. The thing about powdery mildew is we don't have to have free water moving around like rain for this to develop. We just need humid conditions. If you know you've had this issue every year, definitely crop rotate. The other maybe is look for some resistant varieties. Other ways that you can help control this is give your plants adequate room to grow and plenty of air movement. Air movement is key with controlling any of these foliar diseases because that just dries those leaves and it moves that air around. Even if you have high humidity, you have air movement, it's going to help control these a little bit. And then once you first see some of the symptoms and you notice, you may want to start a biweekly spray program, some kind of protectant like mancozeb or dicanyl. There's a lot of other stuff out there too on the market, but those are the 2 usually that's easy for homeowners to get. Gummy stem blight, you can see there that stem actually has got a rot in it there, and you can see the little ooze if you see that black speck there. It's kind of a dry rot in moist or wet conditions, but the disease does overwinter in plant residue and save seeds. So if you're a seed saver and you've had this, maybe time to get you a different seed stock, which, from a different source. There are some seed treatments you could do if it's coming from your seed. But again, get all that debris out of there because it can overwinter. A good way to control this, if you know you've had it in your soil, is just by doing a crop rotation of 3 to 4 year, keeping cucurbits out of that area of the garden. To help control it, you can spray with dicanyl or mancozeb on a 7-day rotation while conditions persist for development. Another one is to plant disease-resistant varieties, and you'll see that pretty much anytime there's a disease that we talk about with any plant, if you can plant a disease-resistant variety, you're going to be ahead of the game. One more disease that you may see, some years this can be really bad, some years not so bad, but this is downy mildew. It's on the underside of the leaf there, and that leaf is turned over and you can see the spots. You can see the circular yellow spots on the leaf with mold developing on the bottom of the leaf. But the disease generally develops at the crown and works its way outward and is encouraged by wet, humid weather. So if we have a wet, humid summer, you're more likely to see this, and this can destroy an entire planting really quickly. So as soon as there's a little bit of this out there, you need to really start on a disease spray program. Commercial growers of pumpkins and things really have to be on top of this disease because it can take the whole crop out pretty quick. So you want to control with targeted sprays of dicanyl and mancozeb. And what those two do is actually kill spores, and the leaf that it's coated on, it can protect it from being infected. When you're harvesting your cucurbits, you want to harvest the first summer squash at about 7 to 8 weeks after seeding. When your fruit are 2 to 3 inches in diameter and 7 inches long or smaller, depending on however you like yours. If you like them a little larger, let them get a little larger, a little smaller. It's totally up to you. I know a lot of people out there that have ideas of when they want to eat theirs, but this is about where I usually will pick mine. You want to handle your summer squash gently. It can bruise easy. It has a really soft skin on it, so you want to handle those with care. And you can refrigerate these for up to a week, maybe a little longer, depending on If you wrap them in maybe a little plastic grocery bag and put them in the crisper, usually though a week's about as long as I like to keep them. And by that point during the growing season, you're usually getting so much summer squash that you're giving it away. You're probably not storing it for a week. Um, Winter squash and pumpkins are harvested 3 to 4 months after planting. So you want to make sure you count your date, make sure you have enough time for them to get mature. And then you want to harvest your winter squash and pumpkins before a hard frost. A light frost is not necessarily that bad, but a hard frost can damage the outside of that pumpkin skin and can cause them not to be able to be stored as long. But if you use them for decoration, it's probably not going to be that big of an issue. But if you're wanting to store them to eat later, then definitely you want to go ahead and get them harvested before we have that hard frost. The outer skin of a winter squash and pumpkin should resist your fingernails. So they're relatively hard when you stick your fingernail and try to poke. Definitely very hard compared to your summer squash skin. You want to cure your winter squash and your pumpkins by exposing them to 80-degree temperatures for 7 to 10 days, if you can. If you can't do that, sometimes just getting them into a dry, clean environment that is not in a frost or freeze situation may be your only option. That's better than nothing. But if you can cure them at that 80-degree temperature for 7 to 10 days, you can get a much longer storage life out of them. And then after that initial 7 to 10 days, you want to store them relatively cold at 40 to 45 degrees if you can, and they'll store for up to 2 to 3 months, depending on variety. Some of these will store for up to 10 months, even a year, depending on some of the old varieties that are out there. As far as the time that you can store some of these, it's going to depend on a lot of factors, but some of it's going to be with your personal experience with growing some of these older varieties and how long they may be able to be stored. Here's a lot of different varieties out there, and I'm going to go through these really quickly. And I'm just scrolling through the pictures here. You can see all the squashes that in sizes and shapes that are out there. These are summer squashes, and then we have some winter squash. A lot of variety with these out there, even the little woody ones and some other things out there. They're all tasty though. If you want to try some of these, by all means, they're really nice to try. They're also very nice to use for decoration, for fall decoration if you'd like. The bottom right there, some of those are varieties of those are out on the market. Pink banana and a lot of different varieties are out there. That's the one that I have been able to store for up to a year at room temperature, and it was still fine, and it wasn't dried up inside or anything. It was still fine to eat.